Okay, good morning, grade 10. Hope you're well. Hope you had a fun weekend. In this video, I'm just going to explain what your tasks are for this week. As you know, with the new schedule, we have certain slots where English teachers are available for questions. We may choose to schedule lessons during this time. But obviously Thursday and Friday are a holiday, so I will be available. When will I be available? I will be available Monday, 7:30 to 8:30. I will be available Tuesday, period 4, which is 11:30 to 12:30, to answer questions, to help, to give you some feedback on this. So the first thing you need to do is you need to take the Othello summary test, which is on Google Classroom. It's a Google Forms. Take your time with this. If you need to reread the summary, if you need to reread the play, if you need to watch a summary video, do whatever it takes, then take the test. I am more worried about you understanding the plot than necessarily scoring highly, so take your time with this. It is really important because you do need to understand the plot in its entirety going forward. So once you've done that, once you've filled in the Google Forms, we're going to look at the conventions of a Shakespeare tragedy. So what are the conventions of Shakespeare tragedy? So a Shakespeare tragedy typically includes the following aspects. 1, it has the fatal flaw or hamartia. 2nd, the idea of good versus evil. 3rd, there's always a conflict, sometimes internal, sometimes external. 4, this idea that the bigger they are, the harder they fall. 5, some sort of external pressure. And 6, a Fireback structure. So I'm just going to go through and talk a bit more about each of these. So the fatal flaw, or hamartia, I said hamartia earlier, didn't I? Hamartia is Greek for sin or error, and it refers to the fatal flaw in our protagonist. So it's different from Greek tragedy. In Greek tragedy, there's not really a sense of free will about our protagonist. They are merely involved in something bigger than them. But in Shakespeare, the protagonist has the chance to make the right decisions. Their fate is not sort of preordained. But because of the flaw in their character, they make the wrong decisions. And A.C. Bradley says that the calamities and catastrophe follow inevitably from the deeds of men, and the main source of these deeds is character. So that's really important. So what character flaws does Othello have? Next, we think of this idea of good versus evil. So his tragedies often contain the conflict between the theme of good versus evil. And in tragedy, evil always triumphs. And one of the reasons is, while goodness is sort of open and visible to everyone, evil is hidden, it is deceitful, it's mysterious. So while we the audience, may see this evil happening through dramatic irony, the protagonist doesn't, often until it is too late. And often by the time they've realized, they have already sealed their fate. And Edward Doden wrote about this. He said that tragedy is concerned with the ruin or restoration of the soul and the life of man. In other words, subject to the struggle of good and evil in the world. Obviously, conflict is another key convention of a Shakespearean tragedy. So it can be internal conflict. So the protagonists may have doubts, they may have conflict in their minds about what course of action to take. They may be racked with guilt, jealousy, or even paranoia. That's obviously very relevant to Othello. Don't get confused between jealousy and envy. Okay, so remember, envy is when you see what somebody else has and you want it. Jealousy is when you are scared of losing something you already have. And it can be external conflict. So the protagonists may also have conflict with other characters and events. This is often a physical conflict. And while the protagonist may be successful in some external conflicts, ultimately they're not. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. You'll notice with Shakespeare's tragedies, you'll certainly notice when you do Macbeth next year, that Shakespeare often uses sort of noblemen or men of stature as his protagonists in his tragedies. And this means that when they fall, it really exaggerates the tragic nature of their tale. If this is, if you replace Othello with somebody who's not important and lives a really menial life, a really poor farmer who's paranoid about his wife, it's not as meaningful. And remember, in Shakespeare's time, it was often just the nobility and the clergy who were educated. So their downfall can show that evil can attract even the mightiest. External pressures, so similar to external conflicts, our protagonist faces pressure from an external source. It may come from the supernatural, like in the case of Macbeth, or it may come from our antagonist, in this case Iago. And last but not least, the Fireback Plot. So Shakespeare tragedies has a 5-act structure, which you know because you've all read Othello. So in part 1 we have the exposition. So this outlines the situation, it introduces the main character, begins the action. Part 2, we have the rising action. So the development of the action continues, and this is often where a complication is introduced. Then in part 3, we have the crisis or climax. Now this isn't necessarily the climax in its traditional, when you think of a climax in a Transformers film as the last big battle scene. This isn't that type of climax. This is the climax where the change of direction happens. And when I mean the change of direction, this is the point where our protagonist has the last chance to make the right decision. And from here, they're on a downward spiral in terms of their deeds become bad. They often become increasingly violent and deranged. So this leads us to part 4, which is the fall action. And this is obviously when there is a lot of conflict, because our protagonist is often in external physical conflict with other characters, because they still want to escape their fate. At this point, they still think they can escape their fate due to the bad decisions they've made. And in part 5, we have the denouncement and resolution, in which the final crisis or action or revelation and resolution are explained. So this is where you have your final action and you have a resolution. Now notice that resolution doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as poetic justice. And obviously in the case of Othello, without saying too much to spoil your test, we ask ourselves at the end, is poetic justice done in the end? So what I want you to do is very simple. This is Freytag's pyramid, and here you can see you have your exposition, which introduces, rising action, which conflict builds, the climax, so the fatal flaw of our protagonist seals his fate. This is the last chance he has to do the right thing, to make the right decision, to beat evil. And from here, he's still heavily involved in the action, there's often violence, and lastly we have this denouncement. So what you're going to do is, in your study guide, you're going to start filling in the second section, which is plot and conventions of a study guide. So firstly, you need to write a plot summary for Othello. It can be very, very brief, don't make it too long, don't just make it copy and pasted from SparkNotes summary. Think about making it as a flow chart. Think about how you can make it visually engaging. Secondly, you need to add conventions of a tragedy to your study guide with some examples of Othello. You may need more than one slide for all of these. That's fine. Take as many slides as you need. And lastly, draw Freytag's pyramid and add in the key plot points from Othello. And it's really easy to do on Google Slides. This was actually done just by drawing lines. So it's not difficult. If you want to use something else and then paste it there, that's fine. So that's what your work for this week is going to be. As I mentioned, I am available for questions and help during periods 1 on Monday and period 2 on Tuesday. I'll be available on Google Hangouts as ever, and enjoy.